The ancient Near East presents a stark geographical divide, where arid desert expanses abruptly give way to the fertile floodplains of Egypt. For centuries, the accepted historical baseline has placed the ancient Israelites within that Egyptian territory for 400 continuous years of enslavement. This 4-century metric forms the backbone of standard academic chronologies and is taught as undisputed historical and theological fact. Yet mapping this long timeline against the internal family records from the exact same era creates a severe chronogenealogical paradox. By accepting the 400-year figure without question, chronologists have overlooked a mathematical contradiction embedded directly within the foundational texts. The entirety of this historical model originates from a single source text, Genesis chapter 15, verse 13. The verse reads, "Thy seed shall be a stranger in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years." Scholars have historically taken this prophecy and overlaid it completely onto the era of Egyptian bondage. Applying this passage as a strict measure of time spent inside Egypt without cross-referencing demographic data immediately breaks the structural integrity of the historical model. If the source text is mathematically accurate, the traditional way we measure its timeline inherently fails. To test the timeline, we turn to the demographic data recorded in Exodus chapter 6, verses 16 through 20. This passage lays out an explicit, uninterrupted family line stretching from the patriarch Levi down to Moses. Looking at this diagram, the lineage begins with the first node, Levi. He represents the generation that initially migrated across the border into Egypt. The descent continues through his son Kohath and his grandson Amram. The sequence concludes with Amram's sons Moses and Aaron establishing a strict, inflexible limit of exactly 4 generations between entering Egypt and leaving it. Testing the traditional model requires us to take the assumed 400 years and divide it by these 4 specific generations. Allocating 400 years to just 4 individuals yields an average of well over 100 years per generation. Requiring every father in this sequence to live over a century before reproducing defies demographic data and biological probability. This internal mathematical failure proves the 4-century metric is misapplied, forcing a total reevaluation of when the chronological countdown actually begins. The solution to the paradox lies in the exact phrasing of the original Genesis 15 prophecy. The text specifies that the population would be strangers in a land not theirs. It does not explicitly restrict this condition to Egypt. Before moving south, the patriarchs Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob held a specific legal and geographical status. They lived exclusively as nomads within Canaan, residing in a territory they were promised, but which they did not legally own. The condition of being a stranger begins with the initial covenant made to Abraham in Canaan, not centuries later at the Egyptian border. Expanding the geographic scope to include the patriarch's time in Canaan resets the parameters of the entire historical timeline. To validate this shift in the timeline's anchor point, we need a secondary textual witness. That verification appears in the New Testament record, specifically in Galatians chapter 3, verse 17. The text states that the law arrived exactly 430 years after the covenant was confirmed to Abraham. This establishes a definitive chronometer running straight from the moment of the Abrahamic promise, down to the Exodus and the giving of the law at Sinai. This verse definitively rules out measuring the centuries strictly from the point of Israelite entry into Egypt. Multiple independent textual sources demand a timeline anchored to the covenant, rather than the enslavement, proving the structural integrity of this revised model. We can now execute the mathematical synthesis, splitting the 430-year timeline into its historical components. This timeline visualizes the calculation. Starting at the Abrahamic covenant, the first segment measures the duration spent as strangers in Canaan, totaling approximately 215 years. The transition point occurs midway through the epic, when Jacob's family crosses into the land of Egypt. Subtracting the Canaan years from the 430-year total gives us the actual duration of the Egyptian habitation, the remaining 215 years. We now reapply the rigid 4-generation genealogy of Levi to Moses to this newly calculated Egyptian timeframe. Dividing a roughly 215-year span by 4 generations yields a metric of 50 to 54 years per generation. A 50-year interval perfectly aligns with known historical demographics and biological reality. By correctly identifying the starting point of the prophecy, the mathematical contradiction vanishes, leaving a highly precise chronological record. This 4-century timeline tracks the span of an entire covenantal epoch. The Exodus stands as the mathematically punctual fulfillment of a multi-century promise. When cross-referenced accurately, without overlaying external assumptions, ancient texts display a rigorous internal precision. True historical analysis requires discarding deeply entrenched assumptions the moment the internal data demands a different reality.